Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Leah, and I work at the library. And thank you for joining us on evening 2 of our first ever Teton Writers series. And we started it because we get a lot of writers, and we have a lot of writers in Jackson writing books, and it's hard to have individual presentations for each one. So we thought this was a great way to showcase the spectrum of authors and work that's being done. And we're so lucky to be in this town of creativity and talent and literature. And we want it to be a space where writers meet each other, get inspired from each other, and readers find new work and know their neighbors. And so hopefully that happens. And we're excited one day to do this in person. So all this transpires. And our first one last week went really well, and I think that happened where people were exposed to new topics of interest and made new friends. So hopefully that happens. And like I said earlier, if you weren't on the call, then how it's going to go is we have 4 authors to showcase tonight, and each one gets 20 minutes to give a presentation, whether it's like how do they write or reading a section from their books. And then 10 minutes for questions on each one. And first in the lineup is it Joanna or Joanna?
Joanna.
Joanna, okay. So we have Joanna Cook, and Joanna Cook writes books for young people, focusing on nature and the human experience. Her debut picture book, The Sequoia Lives On, earned a starred Kirkus Review, and her middle grade novel, Call Me Flory, was on a school library journal summer 2020 reading list. Due out in spring 2022, Joanna's third untitled picture book is A Natural History of Fire. Joanna earned an MFA in creative writing from Lesley University in the Writing for Young People genre, and an MED in elementary education from Prescott College. Prior to writing, she spent 10 years working as an environmental educator and naturalist in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. She lives with her husband and son in Jackson. And so now I'll turn it over to Joanna.
Great. Thanks, Leah. And thanks to Leah and to the Teton County Library for making this possible. It's exciting for me to, there's some of the authors here tonight that I am familiar with. And as Leah said, it's a great opportunity for authors to be kind of stepping out of our own genres to connect with authors and the other authors and writers in our community that kind of live in different genre worlds. So it's really exciting to be here. I kind of had my own introduction that said a lot of what Leah said, so I'm going to skip it a little bit, but needless to say that the slide you're looking at now is all of the covers or an unfinished proof from my third book, but I've been really lucky to have worked with the Yosemite Conservancy, which is a nonprofit dedicated to connecting people with Yosemite National Park on all 3 of my books. And so they specialize in Sierra Nevada natural and cultural history. Sequoia Lives On was the first project we did, nonfiction picture book. Then we did a middle grade historical fiction, Call Me Floy, and Fire Shapes the World will be out next year. And it's really through writing Call Me Floy, this third project, which was a historical novel for middle grade readers, that I learned a lot of the concepts that I have, I'm going back in time, that I learned a lot of the concepts we'll discuss today, as well as an unpublished manuscript that we'll be exploring a little bit. And so the topic of my talk is modern hearts in historical stories. Writing engaging historical fiction requires creation of a bridge between 2 worlds, the past time and place the readers inhabit, and the modern life of the characters inhabit, and the modern life of the reader. And our goal is to find concrete ways to make that bridge so our historical stories are immersive and relevant to modern readers. When we think about historical fiction, we might imagine empire wastes from the Regency era, World War II spies in action, or Roman empresses lazing in the Mediterranean heat. And these times seem impossibly different from the world that we live in today. But what if there was a way to see that those worlds weren't that different? And what if we could afford our readers a seamless entry into a long gone era that allowed them to connect in an intimate way with characters from another time? How do we help them find commonality? And this is me from the 80s, the 1980s. I grew up in New Jersey, and And I, as a child, had a natural imagination. It's something that children have and that some of us maintain as we get older. Writers are included in that group. And I often dreamed of living a century or two earlier, in the 1780s, perhaps, instead of the 1980s. I think I even said more than once that I belonged in another time. That's the way I saw myself. And I imagined myself maybe as a frontierswoman. I'd never been west of Ohio, and I didn't really know anything of the American West, but that didn't matter. I could imagine myself in that place. And it's possible that you imagined yourself living in another time. The questions that drew me to fantasize about riding horses through mountains and cooking over a fire are the same questions that I explore as a writer today. What is nature? What is our place in it? How do we find strength in it? And how can we protect it? And back then, of course, I didn't think about it that way, but these early imaginings were the seeds for the writing life that I'm living today. My first historical project I started writing in 2011, 10 years ago. And my disclaimer is that I'm still working on that first project. That story is set in 1699 in the metropolitan city of Amsterdam, before crossing the Atlantic to the wild coast of South America, where sugar plantations and all their atrocities dominate the landscape. My character, Dorothea, has joined her mother on a naturalist expedition to study insects in Suriname's jungles. And right away, I'm sure that you can imagine the worlds that Dorothea inhabits. You can see the three-masted ship sailing across the expansive ocean. You can see the canals and row houses that she lived in. You can see sugar cane being cut by toiling men, and you can see brilliant blue butterflies dancing through a lush jungle. In writing historical fiction, it's most natural to start with the details of a world and centering those details on the page. It's what draws us in as writers, and it's what draws us in as readers. So these differences in the food, the artistry, the technology, the music, the spiritual and political spheres that draw us in and that help us kind of time machine ourselves into a different place. These kind of details in historical fiction generally remain true to fact. And unless we're writing revisionist novels, events, politics, and culture remain unchanged. It's worth pointing out that historical fiction, by some definitions, must be set 50 years into the past. By other definitions, the writer must perform research into the setting and time period, rather than draw on personal experience. But either starting point creates difficulties for a writer in writing successful historical stories. In this light, my childhood in the 1980s isn't historical, as different as that world is from the landscape of childhoods today. But I've come to understand that perhaps it's more important to think about how far into the past the reader is being taken. The 1980s certainly feels pretty historical to my son. There's no internet? That sounds pretty far away, just as different on some level as Regency era or Roman times. But the first step in historical fiction is imagining a setting into being. And that way, readers of historical fiction like middle school Joanna can imagine themselves mounting a sturdy pony and galloping off into the mountains to hunt. It can be tricky to have too many details in historical fiction. Research is intoxicating for the writer, speaking from experience. And not only can details bog down the writing process, they can create a distance between the reader and the character. If there is so much setting and culture and politicking on the page, there might not be enough time for something to actually happen to your character. And it's not the details that will ultimately elevate a historical story into one that readers can relate to. But what is? And of course, you can guess that I'm going to say character is what will actually help readers connect. And it's cliche how many storytellers insist that character is paramount. Either Ray Bradbury or Rita Mae Brown, Ava DuVernay, William James, Toni Morrison, Anne Lamott, countless more have said that character is profound. It's the most important. This historical story in progress just underwent a major revision for the umpteenth time. And it's all because I didn't work on character in such a way that would make my story more relevant and immersive to my reader. I thought I knew who my character Dorothea was, but our relationship turns out to have been rather superficial for a really long time. And we'll come back to Dorothea in a little bit. But in the beginning, writing my middle grade novel, Call Me Floy, didn't extend over a decade, thankfully. I already knew the setting. I had an intimate connection with Yosemite National Park, having lived and worked in the valley for almost 8 years. It was easy to imagine myself in that place, and in a place that, for all intents and purposes, hadn't changed that much since 1876 timing of the story. But what did I know of Floy? This is a picture of her at age 15. I was writing about her at age 12, but we don't have any photographs of her from that time. So what was Floy's story? In truth, I knew little of Floy, save the scant stories of her riding wildly across the valley floor to greet stagecoaches and her untimely death due to a falling rock. But that little bit was enough for an entry to Floy, enough to tell me she had a reputation for unconventional behavior, for breaking gender stereotypes, for living life to the fullest. Unconventional characters, those that play at the boundaries of their time, be it modern or historical, are the ones that readers often like to see. We enjoy conflict, especially when it's somebody else's. We enjoy seeing the what ifs play out. And what if a character broke the mold of the expectations of their time? Despite having done this little bit of research into Floy's life, I knew that my bridge to Floy would involve this reputation, and a reputation that she really didn't enjoy. But could I find anything else about her? How did she really feel about these? When I first sat down to write about Floy, I used this idea of the reputation and played on it. And these are the first words that I wrote about that story. Not many people, let alone a girl my age, can say they are the heroine in a real novel, and a novel for grown-ups no less. Zanita, the book of which I am speaking, was published when I was only 6 years old, and I'm just shy of 12 now. In truth, being cast as a heroine has been a dismal thing to endure. For now, when people come to explore the dear Yosemite Valley I call home, they expect Zanita, the girl from the novel. Her nickname was Squirrel, just as mine once was. And she is mischievous, like I am prone to be, but I am not her. I am Florence Hutchings, and you may call me Floy. These words, the very first words I wrote when I started this novel, ended up becoming a prologue. There were some edits, but straight away, the reader catches the conflict that Floy had around this reputation and her desire to claim her own identity. The story was based on a real person, and I wanted to make sure that this hunch, this gut response to writing was on point. So I took a deep dive into research, as all historical fiction should. I hoped to find first-person references, something written by Florence herself. But in addition to reading numerous accounts and resources online, I visited the California State Library, the Bangkok Library, the personal collection of the former park historian of Yosemite National Park, the archives at Yosemite, and the collection of the Yosemite Museum. But obvious or direct references to Floy were few, and I found nothing that I could say for certain were her own words other than signatures on registers. Nothing of her personal thoughts. This is a math book that has her signature in it, but I don't know any of her own thoughts. And that's a really common challenge when you're writing historical fiction based on real people, or if you're writing historical fiction based on characters that you're inventing on your own. We don't necessarily know, maybe there's more freedom in that, but we don't know who they are. So I couldn't use research to get to know Floy more personally, but I needed to get closer. And so I needed to look at the inner narrative of Floy's mind in order to figure that out. And I'd like you to consider 3 historical novels. In Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, Scarlett O'Hara's heart is on the page. She is hopeful despite every painful moment of struggle. In Remarkable Creatures by Tracy Chevalier, the dual narrators of Mary Anning and Elizabeth Philpott share an emotional thread knotted in themes of friendship, jealousy, and what it means to be a woman. Both of these stories are rich in historical details, and they have strong emotional stories that pull the reader in and keep the reader there. In The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton, this was grounded in well-researched details in 17th century Amsterdam, the same time period that I'm writing in for my work in progress. But that alone did not carry the story for me. Without developed emotional themes, the story flopped. I was left with many questions about the characters, about what motivated them and what lay in their hearts. And so this brings me back to Floy. How could I discover who she was, or at least some idea of how she might have seen herself without her own recollections? Was there a way that I could see inside her heart? And there is. The way into the heart of a historical character, or any character, one might argue, lays inside the writer's heart. All the research on Floy pointed to her love of nature. And as you know from a young age, I've also loved nature. For me, this was an obvious connection. Combined with what I imagined as her resistance to having her reputation and her love of nature, I created a storyline that had her pursuing a dream against the expectations of everyone she knew to climb her beloved mountain. Sometimes a story needs more investigation. In this latest revision of my work in progress, I knew my protagonist Dorothea had a deep and profound connection to nature, as Floy and I do. This certainly comes on the page of my writing. But our shared connection to nature wasn't bringing enough emotional depth to her journey. And I knew less about the places and time in which she lived. The setting and time period challenges could be mitigated somewhat. A Wyoming Arts Council grant enabled me to travel to Amsterdam to go to a conference about her mother, naturalist artist Maria Merriam. Again, there's no images of Dorothea, but only of her infamous mother. But I was able to walk the canals of the city and imagine Dorothea on those same streets. I've never traveled to Suriname, and so I've had to use surrogate trips to tropical places to imagine myself in a sweltering jungle setting. And like with Floyd, there were precious few first accounts or no first accounts from Dorothea's own inner mind. Nothing told me of what she really thought about things. And there were no pictures. So I was at risk of bringing to life this amazing, wondrous world that she inhabited, but without having the reader have an entry point into her. And so how could I find my heart connection to Dorothea in the same way I found an entry point for Floy? One of the things that differed between Floy and Dorothea is that Dorothea was unconventional because of a circumstance. She didn't have her own reputation as being a mold breaker. It was her mother's reputation. And so Dorothea seemed to be just along for the ride. And in order to get closer to her, I had to start asking different questions. My questions went beyond what she had in her pocket, in her case, a sketchbook, or what kind of food did she eat when she was in Suriname, lots of cassava. So a writer friend suggested that I imagine Dorothea sitting on the couch at a therapist's office. What questions might she be asked, and how would she reply? If I asked her questions like, what was holding her back? Or what secret did she have that she would never tell anyone? What embarrassed her? What would Dorothea say to those questions? It felt a bit like researching the surface details of a different era, but instead of the stacks at the library, I was kind of nooking around in my character's mind. And then her insecurities started to come out. The stories that Dorothea carried from her childhood rose to the surface. And an even more important question that my writer friend asked was, what did I have in common with her? Why did I relate to Dorothea so much? And kind of embarrassingly, I hadn't even realized a critical circumstance that she and I shared. It took me 10 years to understand this of working with her, so hopefully your discoveries don't take as long. But so Dorothea is a real person. She and her mother did travel to Suriname in 1699. They did study the metamorphosis of insects. Years after that expedition, Dorothea continued her own life as an artist and eventually worked for Peter the Great, Tsar of Russia, in his natural history collections. But as I imagined in her story, a young woman, as I imagined her in this story, a young woman get to embark on her own journey, I saw a person walking in the shadow of a fierce mother. Might Dorothea have struggled to see herself as an artist? My own mother was an artist. My sister is an artist. And I've always considered myself less of an artist than either of them, despite the fact that they create visual art while I'm a writer. It's incomparable, really. But this insecurity, this constant comparison became my emotional through line for Dorothea's journey. When would she see herself as competent and worthy of the artist's identity? Who can't relate to this quest for self-determination? But recognizing that in myself allowed me to dig deeper into Dorothea's own mind. When I think back to Floy, I realize that I'm also personally interested in the reputations that I have and how they affect my choices. And so even though I didn't name that connection at the time, I had another connection to Floy in that way as well. So writing from your own heart is a way to draw out the humanity of your characters. Across history, the psychological and emotional worlds of Homo sapiens remain the same. Joy, pain, desperation, love, jealousy, these are universal, which on some level also makes them modern. What changes is the lens, the constraints of the setting and time period. History and cultures of the times will challenge those universal shared feelings. If you think back about the success of the Outlander series, a woman travels back in time and the audience gets to watch the tension play out on the page or on screen. There's a natural way for the imagination of the audience to put themselves into the scene, although most historical stories don't use that particular plot device to carry the tension. The main character, Claire, is a nurse with an understanding of modern medicine because she's from the 1940s. But in order to be accepted by the people of 1740s Scotland, she must wield that knowledge carefully. The key here is a modern heart. Claire finds ways to connect with people through universal psychology and emotion. It's the lens through which she sees the history's events and conflicts that brings a modern sensibility, even if she can't always act in, or what was to her, a modern way. With Dorothea, I realized that for modern readers to relate to her, she had to confront a big issue of the time that I hadn't addressed. She had to, in some way, confront and act against the slavery that she was witnessing on sugar plantations. At the same time, I understood that Dorothea couldn't become an abolitionist. Abolition was too early in its development, and she wouldn't have been involved in those conversations anyway. Therefore, such a transformation would likely feel inauthentic to the reader. So I found a way for her to have a connection to the enslaved people that she met and act on their behalf in a way that modern readers would accept. So in writing historical fiction, authors must seek a balance. They must push against the conventions of the time, but not in such a way that the story becomes believable. Time travel notwithstanding, of course. So here's a quick graphic to kind of put some of these ideas together. I'm imagining that there's 4 layers to a story. You start with a basic sketch of a character, and then you have that character have a desire. These are the universal. The next 2 layers are the stakes that a character faces because of that desire, and the obstacles to that desire that stand in the way of achieving that desire. So consider it this way. Dorothea is a young woman living under the shadow of her mother, character. Her greatest desire is to be a successful artist, desire. And those universal concepts could be found in any time, in any place. Those are transferable, so those help a modern reader connect to a historical character. Once I add in more layers, if she tries to achieve her dream and fails, these are sort of the stakes, she will have no way to make a living, and her mother will consider her a failure and a disappointment. She lives in Europe in 1699 and she's impeded not only by her mother's self-absorption, but also by society's ideas about women. Those are some of the obstacles that she has. And those are restricted to the era or time period. When these universal and time period constraints work in concert, then that's where the work of this bridge can be made. Here are some suggestions that hopefully are helpful for you. Start with research, just enough to set a scene and a mood. You can add in more details as you go, but setting is going to be your entry point for a story. And pick a universal emotion, for example, jealousy, and you might consider writing about it from a historical perspective and a modern one, and see in that writing, that experiment, if you can discover something about that emotion and about the influence that the setting has on, or the setting and the time period have on how a character might feel that emotion. You might try to meet your unconventional character. Do they meet, or do they defy expectations on their own because of their own character, or by circumstance, because of, like as in Dorothea, from the sort of world that she's been put into? And then really try to dive into your character's heart by finding the connections within your own. What do you have most in common with your protagonist? And how can you leverage that to bring a living, breathing character onto the page? The modern heart in historical stories is as much about pulling history forward into a modern context as it is about infusing modern philosophies back into the past. What I mean by that is we can't change the past by overlaying current understandings on top of fresh events and characters, but we can find fresh meaning about the issues of today by reflecting on the confines of the past, by naming the universal truths found inside the hearts of the character, author, and reader, and pushing those truths through the challenges unique to a certain time period. We can create immersive and relevant stories. And by doing that, we might discover a bit more about ourselves. And that's the talk.
Yay, that was wonderful. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself, ask the question, raise your hand. I'll ask a question while people are, or Gail, go for it. You have to unmute yourself.
I guess more than a question, I have a thankful comment. My book is also historical fiction, and so I can totally relate to the process that you went through, and it was really validating to hear that someone else is as obsessive about research as I am. But yeah, I just I don't hang out with writers, and you make me want to hang out with writers. So that's all.
Writers are fun. We should have tea.
I think so.
Lemonade. Yeah, I think that is. I think we all can relate to that idea of that writing life can be lonely. We get fully absorbed into our projects. So there's or we want to use any free time that we have to figure out, to meet the challenges that we're facing in our writing. And I will say that, like, I meet regularly with the Kidlit group, which is really great, even if I'm not submitting some of my own work, just to be engaged in the conversation about writing with other people. And that was on some level one of the biggest benefits to doing an MFA, was just engaging with humans and getting to engage on this level where we were really exploring these issues. We end up speaking, no matter what genre we're writing in, we end up speaking these common languages that we all can relate, that other people who aren't writers don't struggle with those same things. And so it's up to you.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I had a question, actually. I'm really curious about this, how you navigate these two kinds of research, right? Which is researching a place and researching the place as a historical place, right? That seems like a really interesting dynamic that you're talking about, where you're situating a story in a place that you might be able to visit in a contemporary setting, but that's a window into that place as a historical setting. So I guess I just would be curious to hear more about how you navigate historical research and lived experience in place.
That's a great question. I think that with Yosemite specifically, having lived there for 8 years, or almost 8 years, and worked in that space, like, I felt that Yosemite Valley, I had a really intimate connection with as a naturalist. And what that meant for me was, I was working with school groups, but we were going into all these spaces in Yosemite where you wouldn't see a lot of people. So on some level, the fact that you would be able to be in a space where you couldn't see a road, and you can see those places in Yosemite Valley, even though it might be hard to imagine, that getting into those spaces would allow me to kind of fantasize back. It would be an easier way to do that, which I would then, for writing this story and thinking about Floy as being, she grew up in Yosemite Valley and was kind of a wild child at a time when she was the only white child in Yosemite Valley. There were, of course, American Indians there that she was connected with, but imagining her slowing down and looking at the minutia of, like, creatures in a log, or looking up at the big mountains, like, I feel like there were a lot of still moments that I could recreate in my own experience of walking around Yosemite. And so when I was doing the historical research there, and you're looking at images, you can go back and there might not be an Umacha there anymore, but everything else is the same. Thankfully, there's no true urban landscape. Like, that landscape hasn't changed as much. Amsterdam on some level was a slightly different. I had been there before, and then I went as a teenager, and then I went back for this conference and was able to just walk around, and this was a street, went to Kirkstraat, and that's a street that Dorothea lived with her mother and her sister. Or I could go to different botanical gardens that were being created at the time that they were there. And I think a lot of that really just comes to the slowing down and looking at the smaller details of that time. It was super important for me to be in place there. The Suriname piece is much harder for me to project myself into, because I don't have the slow moments. I haven't sat in a square in Paramaribo City to figure out what, in the historical areas, there's a lot of UNESCO World Heritage buildings there. What do those feel like when you're sitting there underneath the shade of a certain space looking at that? But slowing down was really key to that. And also just being open to all the different layers of information that you can have, whether it's sensory, whether it's trying to imagine that space from somebody else's perspective. I mean, for me, that was like researching all these different perspectives. But a lot of that was just slowing down and trying to expose myself to as many different travel identities, so to speak, or like travel accounts, so that I can see also how people were seeing it in that time period. You know, you go to Amsterdam today, and one of the churches that's in my manuscript is currently in the red light district. So you have to go and stand at the church and try to, you know, see, like on some level, you're not seeing the forest for the trees. You have to like cut out some of that information and imagine that this is, you're kind of zoning into something. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but.
We have time for one more question.
I'll just have a quick question. Hi, Joanna. I am wondering if the manuscript is, if you're feeling like, yeah, I've had that breakthrough, it's ready. Come on, people, get it published.
It's not ready. But what I did have was that breakthrough, and a lot of it kind of came through working on it in class with Nancy. So we're rethinking like the murky middle of a story. And so I'm realizing that like, well, what I had at the end, the second half of the story is really either I need to move a lot of that earlier. So then I needed to create a whole new second half. And part of that has to do with her journey as an artist. And part of that has to do more with how do that one was a struggle for me in that my early drafts had her observing slavery, and kind of, it was more of an internal journey. And that just at the end of the day, felt like it wasn't going to be, given the climate of conversation that we as artists maybe have a responsibility to be a part of, at least that's my take, that I really wanted to push her as a character. And there's no evidence that she became an abolitionist. There's no reason to have believed that she would have had incredibly progressive thoughts in that way. But what could I do on an individual level where she could leverage her own growth as a person and also maybe take some act? And so I needed to revision that second half with that. So I've gotten to the point where I feel like I have the big pieces in place. But you know, as a writer or as a reader, you can understand that you got to get the big pieces in place, and then you get all the layers of inner dialogue or of minutia or of setting or of how am I expressing this emotion on the page, all of those little things. But I needed to do all this big picture maneuvering that I hadn't done. I've been doing editing, and I needed to do kind of clean slating myself into a really bigger revision. So I feel like things are in the right place, but now I need to give it flesh. I know, probably I talked to you about that story even when I first started volunteering at the library a long time ago. So at some point it'll come to life. But.
Thank you so much, Joanna.
Hello.
Good luck. All right, next up we have Nancy Turner-Stevenson, and she's got a PowerPoint. So I'll let her get that up and then I'll introduce her. Let's see.
Let's see here.
Okay, I'll read your bio. Nancy is the author of 3 middle grade novels from HarperCollins, which have been published internationally and appeared on the Wyoming Indian Paintbrush Award list, the Bank Street College Best Book list, and the Kirkus Review Best Books of 2019 list. A 4th novel titled Dog Quixote and the Great Shelter Heist is told through the point of view of a dog and is forthcoming in 2022. Nancy is on the board of directors at the Jackson Hole Writers Conference and runs Almost Authors, a summer writing workshop series and conference for kid writers only. She's director of education for Off Square Theater Company and is most proud that she can name almost every wildflower or tree that grows in the national forest behind her home where she rides her horse. That is some bragging rights. Without further ado, Nancy, take it away.
Keep in mind, I am a novelist, I'm a storyteller, so that might that might be a little bit over exaggerated, but anyway, Leah, thank you so much. And thank you to the library for doing this. I feel like we're this close to doing this kind of thing in person again, and I'm really excited about that. But I really appreciate this and this opportunity and to get to know these other authors and writers and things. And Gail had mentioned, you know, not hanging out with writers. And I just have to tell you, you just have to do it because we talk the same language. Like if you go to a party and you start talking about your characters and then somebody realizes you're not talking about a live person, they kind of like move away, right? So we can talk about all the weirdnesses about being writers, and all those weird things that happen with it. There are a couple of different parts of my talk, and I want to start out with addressing why I write for kids, which is I do write for kids, as you can probably tell from my my covers of my books. It's magical. That's the start. It's magical. And I'm going to go into that a little bit, my evolution as a writer, as an author, and also the evolution of children's books so that you can see why it's magical and why it's so important and why it's so lovely. How I write. When people ask me that, it kind of stumps you a little bit. And here's my new answer. It's not my new answer, but it's the answer that explains it the best. Robert Frost said once, a poem begins with a lump in the throat. And that's where my stories come from. That's where my books come from. It's a feeling. It's you know, that something that overcomes me, that this is a story that has to get out. And I'll give you an example. Several years ago, maybe 6 years ago, I guess, I was taking a class through St. John's Church called Education for Ministry. And it was a weekly class. It was forever. And one night we were in there, we read something by Frederick Buechner that was just describing the inside of a barn. And it was just this little essay about describing the inside of a barn. And all of a sudden I had this almost like a vision of this girl standing, a 12-year-old girl standing on the threshold of a barn that she wanted to go into, but she was afraid to go into it. That's all I had. But I started writing my second book, Georgia Rules, that night. And I wrote like crazy. And afterwards, it was like a 3-hour class. The two teachers said, wow, you really took some notes tonight. That's so great. And I had to confess that, no, I didn't take one note. I had started a new book. And it was inspired by the feeling that I had listening to that essay written by somebody else. That was the lump in the throat that ignited that book. I am going to start with my own evolution as a writer and go into the evolution of children's books. And then I'm going to swing back into the ways that we find our writing to be meaningful, because can be very lonely. It can be very frightening. It can be very scary. It can be very joyful. It can be very frustrating. It can be very disappointing. There's all kinds of emotions that are packed in with it. And we don't very often get to hear really good feedback from, we get people that say, oh, I loved your book. I loved your book. But when you really find out how one of your books impacted another human in a way that is really magnificent, there's nothing like it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that too, because that is a reward for all the other stuff that we go through. So these are my first 3 books. And I want to mention to you, I was not published until I was 58 years old, which was in 2016. So it is never too late to do what you always wanted to do. And Swing Sideways was my first book. Georgia Rules was my second. Lizzie Flying Solo came out in 2019. These are all published with HarperCollins. And then my 4th book with HarperCollins, Dog Quixote. I'm not positive it's going to make it on the 2022 list. It might be 2023, but we'll see. It's I hope the toughest book I'll ever write, because it's been tough. So I want to share with you, God bless my mother. My mom saved all my early writing things. And I think I was about 7 or 8 when I wrote this. I must have been 7, because I was 8 years old when I changed my name to an I instead of a Y. And this is you can see like the little staples on the one with the cover that are all rusted and everything. My mom saved this for me. Now, I was in my 30s when I was diagnosed with ADD. But if I was able to flip this page, I could show you an example of what that means, because this book stops mid-sentence and half of a drawing done. And then I just went on to the next thing. So I started writing very young. This was my first, I called it a novel. And I kept writing because I just loved it. I started writing poetry. There was a point in time I wanted to be a teacher, so I started writing teacher things. Then I wanted to be a reporter, so I made a reporter, a newspaper, the Shed Reporter, because I was a big horse kid. And then I got into, being a teenager, and I was writing all the drama poems of the drugs and everything going on and around me at the time. But I want to show you why, an example of my passion and my dedication to get this done. So this is in my early 20s. These are some things that I wrote. And you see all the red pen markings on there. So for some strange reason, I thought my brother might be a great person to give me some positive feedback on my writing. He mailed this back to me. This is before the internet. He mailed this back to me, and his wife, who never spent a penny that she didn't have to spend, called me on the phone. And of course, back then it cost you money to call somebody long distance, to tell me that this was coming and not to commit suicide when I saw the red markings, that he did it out of love for me. And it didn't stop me. It did not stop me from pushing forward. And I just kept learning. And I took his things to heart. You can see one of these things in the middle from the University of Texas at Austin. I had written to James Michener, who I love his books, and his assistant wrote me back and said, and I was, my ancestors were all Quaker. He was a Quaker, so we had that in common. But he was very, very encouraging to me. I don't know why I thought that I should send something to him. It's just one of the things that you do before you know what to do. But anyway, so I kept it up. I just kept plugging away. And like I said, I was 58 when my first book was published. I was 56 when I sold my first book. I was 50 when I signed with an agent, and it took us that long to sell something. No, I was actually in my late 40s. Anyway, so on to sort of the evolution of children's books. And this is going to help you understand why it's so magical. Let's start with some of the very earliest picture books, okay? And here they are. Caveman drawings or cave woman drawings told stories. And that's how we've learned so much about the history and our evolution as humans, is through these stories that are told in picture form inside caves. Those are the earliest picture books ever. And then we get to things like Grimm's Fairy Tale, the Arabian Nights, and picture books have never, these are sort of like a little bit past the picture book phase, except for that they have a lot of illustrations. But picture books discussion of complex themes like violence and sex and death and grief and human rights violations, they turn these books into really powerful crossover storytelling for all ages. So both of these types of books, they're aimed at children, but they were, as you know, they're very, very dark, even savage. They have very savage themes. Picture books have always had a documented history of radical politics. They also have a playful side, which is good, because after these kinds of things, we need it. So we have two books here. These are picture books. Giraffes Can't Dance. And if you have any little children in your life and you don't have that book on your shelf, you need to get it, because every time they see you, they will ask you to read it again and again and again. And it's a delight to read. The Day the Crayons Quit. Lovely, lovely, lovely books. We also move into, now we have what are called STEM books, which stand for science, technology, engineering, and math. And these are picture books that introduce kids into topics that previously really weren't explored very much in children's literature, but they're very important now. And they also, most of the time, highlight women who made big changes in our world in these areas. And then, of course, we have the really beautiful books like On the Night You Were Born, Nancy Tillman, a really lovely, lovely, just a lovely book. She's a lovely writer. These are books that you read to your kids at night when they're going to sleep, and they're peaceful, and they really serve a purpose, and they make the child feel very loved, and really beautifully illustrated. So we're kind of going through a little bit of the different changes and things and the different way that these books have come about. When I was a kid, which was 100 years ago, these are the books that I learned on, and we didn't learn to read until first grade. Now kids don't go to kindergarten unless they can read. But is anybody old enough to remember this book? Fun with Dick and Jane? Yeah. And you see the illustrations, but very, very simple text. So those are the ones that I learned from. And now kids, you move up into a little bit further where there's more words on the page, like with the Magic Tree House books. And the kids get very, very excited when they can read an actual chapter book. They're very, very excited about it. But they still include a good amount of illustrations. So with middle grade books, which is what I currently write, you move into deeper themes. You move into things like how the character explores their world. So we have like the old standbys, like Richard Peck, A Year Down Yonder, and I think he wrote this in the 60s, maybe. It's still really popular and timeless. The Kate DiCamillo books, like Because of Winn-Dixie, anything by Kate DiCamillo, just amazing. And then more contemporary type books like Manana Land by Pam Munoz-Ryan, which explores some different themes. Excuse me. Middle grade books, this is where you make or break a reader. Okay. So if you, well, I'll go into that in a little bit. But there's everything like from fantasy to nonfiction. I'm going to give you some other examples. Graphic novels, great way to get kids to, like reluctant readers, to engage in a book because they're full of pictures. They used to be called comic books. They're now called graphic novels, and they approach some really, really important topics for kids, but in a way that is easy for them to read. Nonfiction books are huge in middle grade, and they're written in a way like Joanna's book. Okay, so Joanna's book is historical fiction, but when you have nonfiction books like this one, for example, is written in a way that's really, really interesting and really captures the kids. And then you have books like Fighting Words, which is written by Kim Bradley, and is really pushing people, pushing librarians, pushing teachers, pushing families to get their kids to read things about topics such as sexual abuse. And it was a beautifully, beautifully done book. We have young adult books. Okay, and this is the first book. 17th Summer was published in 1942, and it was the first book that was written specifically for teens. This is also, I have to show you this. This is my mom. This was in 2018. She has since passed away, but I told her that I was reading this, and I was doing a presentation for somebody, and I was talking about this book, and like it sort of started the whole young adult thing a little bit. And she was so excited because that was the first book that she read that was written for kids. It was written for somebody her age. And she was so excited. And she told me she carried that book around for a year and had all kinds of writings in it and dreamt about it, all kinds of things. But it was a girl's first romance kind of book. Books moved into focusing on culture and serious themes with more candor, sort of in the 1970s, like with Judy Blume books, Lois Duncan, Robert Cormier, sort of a time capsule of the high school experience and drama of being misunderstood, because as we know, teenagers are all misunderstood if you ask them, right? They are all misunderstood. So this book in 1970, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, by Judy Blume. So this is the first time she sort of stepped into a new realm with girls talking about things like bras and getting their period the first time, and religion or lack of religion, and sexuality. And this was a groundbreaking book, and sort of changed the rules of what could be written and what could be published. Teens want to read things that relate to them. They want to read things that talk about their state of being, their duality, sort of their resistance to moving forward, but their need to move forward. And then with more contemporary type of young adult books, we have all kinds of things across the board. And a lot of these are books about other worlds. These are about teens caught between two worlds, like The Hate U Give. If you have not read that, you must read it. It's amazing, even if you've seen the movie. It's about a Black girl who lives in a Black neighborhood and goes to a white private school in a different neighborhood. And so she's trying to balance these two lives, and it's about a lot more than that. But it's an amazing book. All these books sort of bring up a lot about social justice. There's paranormal things, and when it shows teen life in constant chaos, right? Which they kind of are, and in constant change. Kids want to read things that are real, that they connect with, and even though things like directly they love the Hunger Games, not because it's real, but because the emotions in that book resonate with them. The emotions are real, and they recognize that, and that's what's really, really important to them. YA books, young adult books, they don't shy away from tackling really deep subjects. The Fault in Our Stars, has to do with cancer with kids. And authors that write for that market, for the teen market, they write with tremendous honesty, as they should. We should never assume that we don't want to tell the kids the truth. So that's sort of the evolution of children's literature, a very brief little snapshot of the evolution of children's literature. But I want to talk also about, let's see, let me get rid of this thing. Whoops, there we go. Let me find you guys again. There we go, perfect. So when I talk about the magic of middle grade and the things that we do, a few years ago, one of my four brothers came to me and he asked me why I write literary fiction for the middle grade market. Because, as he said, authors who write young adult books or books for adults make all the money and they get the movie deals. Well, I mean, it's an okay question, right? I get it. I come from a family of 6 kids. Both of my parents and all 5 of my siblings all either graduated from Ivy League colleges or from University of Texas Plan 2, which is for the genius people. But I didn't go to college. So everything I know, I learned through grit, determination, a whole lot of reading, traveling, conferences, workshops, studying on my own, reading, and thank God for my insatiable curiosity. Now, my brother's question, it's a fair one, but for me, when he asked it, it was delivered, and I took it in with that lifelong sense of not being quite up to snuff with the rest of my family because of my not having a college degree. But it's a rare literary middle grade novel that makes a big splash and earns a lot of money. So you don't go into it thinking that you're gonna. I mean, people probably do go into it thinking that they might make a lot of money doing it, but the truth of the matter is, he's right. It's not the genre that's gonna provide for, a mansion on the hill. And to be honest with you, writing middle grade, it wasn't even a writing voice that came naturally to me, as my editor will attest to. I had to really work hard because I wanted to write in this sort of stuffy, overly poetic prose sort of way. Like if anybody's read Black Beauty, or if anybody's read, anything that's old like that, that's sort of how I wrote in the beginning. And I had to totally revamp the way that I wrote. And I did that by reading hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of middle grade books until I was able to find that specific voice that a middle grade reader connects with. Because if you can have a story that they might resonate with, but if the voice isn't right, they're not gonna engage. They're gonna put it away. And writing for a different market is certainly something that I have considered more than once. But my commitment to writing for kids is really strong. And here's the thing, especially like with middle grade, if you're in a room with 100 adults and you ask them what their favorite book was as a child, and you don't specify an age range, you just say, when as a child, what was your favorite book? 9 times out of 10, they're going to remember a book that they read between the ages of 8 to 12. It could be Charlotte's Web, Anne of Green Gables, Walk Two Moons, My Side of the Mountain, The list goes on and on and on, but they were books that for whatever reason at that moment in their life, which is a really critical moment, really impacted them in some way. And when they answer you, they're probably going to smile when they remember that book. And this is also the prime age that determines whether a kid becomes a lifelong reader. They're sort of perched on this cusp of adolescence, and they're about to go on this laborious hike through these really murky waters and stumble on one of the trickiest paths in their life that they'll ever go through. And the books that we give them right before that journey gives them footing to navigate their way towards adulthood. So it's an age when we as authors, we can assure them and we can say, you're okay. Now go forth and stumble, because they will. But we've given them a foundation. Sometimes I hear rumblings of criticism about a theme in one or another of my books, and it always startles me. I really believe it's our responsibility to offer youth a glimpse of what real life looks like outside of the cocoon of their upbringing. Death happens, anxiety happens, difficult relationships between parent and child happen, blended families happen, moving happens, divorce happens. And what safer place is there for kids to explore these things than on the pages of a book? And if they are not going through those things on their own, surely there's somebody in their life, there's another child who is going through that. And these books help them develop empathy and understanding of what somebody else is going through. If you look at like Linda Sue Park's book, A Long Walk to Water, or the book Wonder, or Jacqueline Woodson's book, Brown Girl Dreaming, these are where children explore the ideas of biracial marriage, of different cultures, same-sex parents, adopted and foster kids, single moms, single dads, people with disabilities, kids with an incarcerated parent, or in my third book, kids who are experiencing homelessness. This is where children see families like theirs who are viewed different as being different. And the message is, you're okay. And it's a really remarkable thing to be able to offer to a child. I didn't start writing out for children with these noble concepts in mind that I was going to change somebody's life or something. I didn't struggle to learn how to write for this age group because I held lofty ideas that my books might change lives. I did it intentionally for two reasons. One, when I was 9, I knew that someday I would be an author. And at that time, I constantly had my face buried in books that took me away from kind of a pretty complicated moment in my life. So books gave me comfort when nothing else did. 2, because I do regret not going to college, and I would have been a teacher if I had been able to go to college. And sorry, can you guys hear my dog? Sorry about that. There's a moose in the yard, so if he gets too loud, let me know. But writing for kids allows me the opportunity to go into schools now and to teach. So when I do that, I can inspire kids to read and write and to let them know whatever challenges life puts in front of them. If they want something badly enough, they can make it happen, because I am living proof. Is that too loud, Leah? Should I go open the door for him? Okay, give me 1 second. Sorry, I will be right back.
Such is the world we live in.
I know.
Good times are good stories.
I know. Hopefully it's not chasing the moose. That's it.
Right.
I didn't put him outside. I just put him down the stairs. There's a moose that's just been haunting him for days. And just every time he sees it now, he just gets really upset.
Well, that's the next picture book that you got to write now.
Maybe so. Yeah. So something happened after my first book was published that made me realize the impact that our stories can have on kids. And when I wrote Swing Sideways, I never say the word anorexia. I never say the word panic attack. But it's clear from the story that the main character, whose name is Annie, is coming from a place where she has been dealing with these things. And now she's going into this summer where hopefully everything is going to change. About 2 months after it was published, I got, maybe it was about a month later, I got an email from a teacher on Cape Cod who emailed me to tell me that a girl in her in her book club at their middle school, her name was Grace. I have permission to say her name. Her name is Grace. Had brought the book to her and said, "We have to read this in book club. We've got to read this." And so the librarian said, "Okay." So Grace gave the librarian this book, and a few days later, she came back to Lizzie, the librarian, and said, "I have to have that book back." And she was kind of frantic about it. She was a little bit frantic about it. And Lizzie said, it's already being circulated with the kids. I don't have it. And she said, "I have to have it back." So Liz that night went to the bookstore and bought another copy of it and gave it back to Grace the next day. And then Grace stopped showing up at school. And a few days went by. It was a small town, sort of like in Jackson. So the teacher, like 3 or 4 days went by, and the teacher called the mom and she said, is Grace okay? There was this odd sort of thing. And the mom said, "No, she's not." And because Grace had read my book, she was able to go to her parents and tell them she understood what was wrong with her, and she was anorexic. And when you're 11 years old, it's pretty easy to hide your anorexia with big clothes and the way that you eat and things like that. Her dad is even a doctor, and they didn't know. So the mom took Grace to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician put her instantly into Boston Children's Hospital because the anorexia had already gotten to the point where it had started to impact her heart. And then after sorry, I get a little emotional. After she was in the hospital, I think she was in the hospital for 3 weeks. She spent the rest of the summer at a camp for kids with eating disorders. And I had the opportunity to talk to the mom on the phone during that time. Liz, the librarian, connected us. And because the eating disorder part was something that was in my history. And so the mom, Liz felt like the mom might like to hear, from me, etc. And we talked on the phone, and she told me all about Grace and everything. And then she said, towards the end of the conversation, she said, "I don't know what would have happened to Grace if she hadn't read your book." And I'm not kidding you. That is 5 Newbery Awards right there for me to hear that. It was amazing. A couple of years after that, I was able to go to that school to do some presentations. And I went to dinner with Grace and her family. And it was amazing. It was so amazing. And just to have heard that and to have known the impact that you have. And I think it's really important for us to remember this kind of thing, because there are some very long, lonely, dark nights and days that we're trying to get this stuff out and get it out right. And there are people who are waiting to hear your words. There are people who are waiting to hear what you have to say. I've had a lot of other letters from kids who wrote, and they said, "Oh, my grandma died from cancer, and I was really happy to be able to read your book," or my parents got a divorce, and I was really happy to read your book. These are kids that took the time to sit down and write an actual letter to me, which I'm incredibly, incredibly grateful for. So I feel like it's important to remember these kinds of things when we're in those, facing the blank page, as we say. Because there are people waiting to hear what you have to say, and it's all valuable. And there you go. Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy. And we're kind of a little bit over, but we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Does anyone have a question for Nancy? I'll start with the question. You sort of touched on it, but how, and kind of like with Joanna's too, how do you go about researching the psychology of young adults? And does that research change, like from historical fiction or modern day teens, and even speech patterns?
So I write realistic fiction, which takes place in this time period. I am fortunate enough, I'm the education director for Off Square Theater, so I am around kids a lot. And so you have to listen. You watch their mannerisms, you watch the way that they interact, you listen to the way that they talk, those kinds of things. So that's probably the biggest thing. But a lot of it also is, it comes from the heart, and it comes from experiences, and it comes from things that you hear. So if you, I told somebody once, I was in the grocery store and there was some people in line ahead of me, and these kids said something, I don't remember what it was. And I was like, oh my God, I got to write that down. And the mom kind of looks at me like, excuse me, who are you? And I, I didn't want to forget it because it was like so precious, right? What the kid had said, it was so precious. And I really wanted to use it. So there's moments like that all the time, but you need to, insert yourself in their lives and listen.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Nancy, I'm just wondering how you exercise your creativity outside of writing.
Thank you for asking that. Like I said, I work with the theater, so there's a lot of creativity in that, but I also teach kids and adults. I mentor adult writers, but kids especially. We've created a really wonderful camp for kids in the summer, and this year we have the very first kids only writers conference. It'll happen in the end of September, and those kinds of things are huge. But I also do, sometimes if I'm really stuck, I'll paint or I'll crochet or something with my hands, that I just have to do, or I'll switch and start writing with my hand. But most of it has to do with kids and inspiring kids and teaching other authors. There's just a lot of soul food in doing that. Thank you for that.
Thank you. All right, so we will go on to our next author, Gail Marie. And if we have time left over at the end and there's still questions, we can open it up to the whole panel. Gail Marie, you can get your PowerPoint up and I will read your bio while you do that.
Hi, Kaylee.
Gail Marie's first career was an astrologer, and that same curiosity about what makes people tick ultimately led to a PhD in clinical psychology. Now retired, she enjoys using her obsessive research methods, her insight into human nature, and her love of magical elements in everyday life to tell her stories. When not listening in on imaginary conversations of her characters, Gail enjoys trail running, hiking with her golden retriever, biking, quilting, and traveling to her favorite places, Peru, Botswana, and Zambia, Africa, and anywhere in France. Her book has earned a gold medal IPPY, a National Indie Excellence Award, and was a finalist for multicultural fiction at the Next Generation Indie Book Awards. She is at work on her second novel, The Muse of Albee. Gail, the stage is yours, and you have to unmute yourself. And then do the share screen.
That's probably not sharing it. Okay, sorry. You showed me how to do this once, and now I don't even see share. There it goes.
Yeah.
It says collaborate with others, use Keynote Live. Use Keynote Live, I bet, right? No? Oh, I'm sorry.
So like if you click the green share screen button, you'll see a panel of like little squares of what is up on your desktop, and just click the one that you want to share.
I'm not seeing, you said a green share?
Yeah, if you hover to the bottom of the Zoom screen where we all are, there right at the then a toolbar will show up, and right in the middle there's a green button that says share screen.
Dang, it's not, I'm not seeing any of that. Oh, share screen. All right. That didn't do it either, did it? No.
There you go. You got it.
Okay, so. Got it?
Looks good.
All right, sorry about that. Okay, hi. I want to thank Leah and the library for doing this, and my fellow writers for sharing some really cool things. stuff to think about. Okay, I'm gonna guess that that everybody out there enjoys stories, and so I'm going to tell you a story, and it's about how a trip evolved into a novel. In May of 2013, I had the privilege of visiting Machu Picchu for the first time. I had intended to get there by way of the Inca Trail, which is typically a 4-day trek. But when I found out that as many as 500 people a day set out on that route, it wasn't anything I wanted to do. Then I learned of a company that limits its groups to 12 guests. Instead of 4 days, the trip to Machu Picchu takes 6 on a much longer, somewhat circuitous route that includes summiting a pass that's almost 15,000 feet high, and then it drops back down to Machu Picchu at 8,000 feet. It's since my personal motto seems to be, if it's easy, it's probably not worth doing. This sounded like my kind of trip, so I immediately signed up. Besides, their website mentioned the fact that every night is spent in a different luxury lodge along the way, with hot tubs and massage therapists and great food and wine. So I flew to Cusco, where I had the great good fortune of being assigned a private guide by the name of Washington Gibaja Tapia, a man who proudly traces his family back to the time of the Incas. Washi showed me around Cusco for a few days while I attempted to acclimate to the over 11,000 foot elevation. On our second day together, he casually mentioned that the hotel in which I was staying had once been the site of an Inca temple. He said the Spanish conquistadors had torn the temple down in the 1500s, and using the Incas' hand-cut blocks of stone, had built a Catholic church in its place, which had subsequently become my hotel. So I was horrified that I was actually staying at that hotel, and I apologized. But Washi only smiled and said, what has happened had to happen. He then showed me the difference between a Spanish wall and an Inca wall. As you can see, the Inca wall requires no mortar. However, the Spanish wall is kind of a mess by comparison. When my time in Cusco came to an end, Washi and I parted, and I joined my group to begin the trek to Machu Picchu. The snowy part, that's where we had to go. And then Machu Picchu is on the other side. Over the course of those 6 days of hiking, I had plenty of time to think about how Washi's Inca spirituality differed from the prevailing Spanish Catholicism. And I was still stymied by the fact that he so gently reconciled himself to the Spanish invaders' attempts to annihilate everything that his ancestors believed in. And as I walked and thought about all this, the idea of writing a novel, it just popped into my head because I thought it was important to talk about the clash of two cultures. This was the absolute first time I'd given any thought to writing this book. So after 6 grueling days, I reached the top where I got it. And then crossing on the other side, I got my first view of the sacred city of Machu Picchu. I think of this as a condor's point of view. So I returned home, very excited about the idea of writing this book, and decided to write it from the perspective of a flawed Catholic priest who must go to Machu Picchu with Pizarro as part of his penance for having broken most of the 10 Commandments. Washi and I had stayed in touch over those 2 years of my research. And when I felt I was ready to go back, I asked him to help me organize a research trip. So Washi and a Keros healer by the name of Eduardo Chira-Apaza met me at the airport in Cusco. But before we'd even reached our hotel, Washi stopped along the banks of the Urubamba River, and we got out of the car, and the two men sat me down on a moss-covered stone. Washi told me that he had sensed a deep sadness in me. And I thought, what's he talking about? Me, sad? And so Eduardo gave me a white heart-shaped rock to hold against my own heart while Washi burned sage and played the flute. Then Washi and Eduardo began to chant in Quechua, which is the language of the Incas, as they blessed me and strengthened me for my journey. Now, I'm not a religious person, at least in the traditional sense of the word. And my heart and soul, my mind was resistant to the prayers, but my heart and soul were apparently not immune to the shaman's ceremony because I was suddenly attacked by my own tears. I still can get emotional thinking about it. And Eduardo was very pleased because he took credit for opening my heart. For the next few days, in addition to what became daily blessing ceremonies, we shared meals with Washi's family. We served hot chocolate to all the kids in his village. And we hiked to the tops of all the surrounding mountains. By the way, this is Eduardo, was such a treat. When there was a space, on the trail, he liked to walk holding my hand. He gave me a special hat to wear in exchange for borrowing mine for a while. So we spent time with women tending their alpacas while carding and hand spinning the wool. We visited a co-op where women cooked large pots of indigenous plants to make their dyes. There's a sample of some of the colors. While other women created these beautiful weavings with the alpaca and vicuña wool. The cover of my book is one such weaving, and it now graces the fireplace in my home. And I think it looks three-dimensional. And of course, I couldn't be that close to Machu Picchu without going back. But because I think of Machu Picchu as a sacred pilgrimage, there was no way I was going to get there by bus. Imagine a steady hour and a half on the Stairmaster, and you'll be close. All along this deep stone staircase from Aguas Calientes to Machu Picchu, I was treated to the sound of water, the Urubamba River, the countless springs, the steady drip from the previous night's rain, begonias, flowering bromeliads, orchids. They were scattered amongst the vines and moss and ferns. And I could swear that I could see things growing. It was so lush and fertile. When I reached the top and the crowds, I guess you know how I feel about crowds already. I continued on more stairs all the way through Machu Picchu to the trailhead that leads to Inti Punku, the Gate of the Sun. There, I found a quiet place to sit off the beaten track where I could still see Machu Picchu. I sat down and pulled out my laptop. Yes, I carried my laptop, my camera, 3 lenses, and I read the prologue and first chapter of The Serpent, the Puma, and the Condor, the same portion of my book I'll be reading for you. It blew my mind, actually, to be reading my manuscript in this place. So then, marathon level, exhausted, sweaty, and starving, I returned to my hotel, quickly showered, grabbed lunch, and just barely managed to catch the train back to Ollantaytambo, where I reconnected with Washi. In case you don't recognize the extremely happy caballera in this photo, it's me. My horse is called Gladiator. He's a Peruvian Paso Fino, a gaited horse, which means you can ride at a trot without posting. My riding companion is Guillermo Mendoza Salazar, an expert on the time period in which I was interested. Guillermo and I spent the day riding through the areas some of the conquistadors had ridden through. Together, we visited the mountainside where over 10,000 men, women, and children were slaughtered by the Spanish soldiers. And we visited the town of Cajamarca, where Pizarro and his men assassinated the Inca king, even after his people had paid his ransom by filling an entire room once with gold and twice with silver. The next few days and evenings were spent interviewing Vidal Ayala Sanchez, quite possibly the most amazing person I have ever met. I got to spend hours with this man asking questions for my book, but our conversations also covered topics like sainthood, karma, the Dalai Lama, and how after 2,000 years, we still seem unable to follow the teachings of Jesus by treating one another with kindness, empathy, and respect. Vidal asked almost as many questions of me as I did of him. Oh, excuse me, I got something in my eye. He was testing me to make sure that my reasons for writing my book were to speak the truth. Then I listened, enthralled, to oral history that had been passed down from generation to generation, from shaman to shaman. Oral history I've woven throughout my book. Oral history that included the prophecy that when the planets were aligned in the same way as they had been during the Great Flood, the same Great Flood in numerous religious traditions, another cataclysmic event would occur. This time, white men from across the sea would arrive by boat and murder or enslave the people and destroy their culture. And as we now know, all of that did happen. As for the answer to my question as to how Machu Picchu had escaped discovery, Vidal would only say that the sacred city had hidden itself because the Spaniards did destroy everything they could find. So when I returned home, I threw out most of the first draft and started over, keeping my flawed priest as a main character, but creating a new character, a female shaman, whose perspective prevails throughout the book. As I was preparing for my talk, I struggled for a bit about whether to include the final part of my trip to Peru. And I decided I would be leaving out an essential piece of the story if I didn't include it. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the plant medicine called ayahuasca, I'll give you a very brief intro. It's made from two plants that are grown in the Amazon that, when cooked together for 3 days and 3 nights, form a hallucinogenic substance. It's been compared to peyote in that it's not taken recreationally, but rather as a means of gaining spiritual insight into one's own psyche. I'd been curious about the plant medicine for some time, but it had never occurred to me that it would play a vital part in my book until after my 4th and final ayahuasca ceremony. Capitari is a no-frills ayahuasca lodge deep in the Amazon jungle. Cold showers, no electricity, small portions of salt-free meals. And yes, I did have an ensuite bathroom, but if you'll notice, it's not really connected to anything. I had to collect water from a nearby stream with a bucket and flush that way. So I won't lie, the nausea and purging were very, very difficult. The brew didn't taste too bad the first night, But every night it became thicker and thicker and nastier and nastier. The ayahuasca ceremonies themselves were rich sensory experiences. Don Lucho and his son sang Icaros throughout the night that both kept me grounded and took me away. The astonishing images that played in my mind during all 4 ceremonies shared a common theme, that of loving and being loved, a beautiful thing. So I readily admit that I underestimated the power of this trip. I mean, not only did it inspire a book, but I thought only the Capitari Lodge at the end would be challenging. But from Washi's first blessing ceremony to my final night with Mother Ayahuasca, I underwent a serious spring cleaning of my psyche and came away with the knowledge that publishing this book would take precedence over everything else. I can only hope that I've done my subject justice, because as Vidal told Washi, Machu Picchu has chosen Gail to tell its story. So now I'd like to read to you a little bit from The Serpent, the Puma, and the Condor. I was going to take you back to the cover if I can. There you go. Some say it was the interventions of a serpent, a puma, and a condor that kept the existence of Machu Picchu a secret from the civilized world for almost 400 years. That it was their actions that prevented the sacred city's discovery and inevitable destruction at the hands of the Spanish conquistadors. Prologue, June solstice, Machu Picchu, 1511. Their heads bowed in reverence, 10 young women file silently past the high priest's palace, each selected for her grace and purity, each dressed in an identical white tunic of the finest vicuña wool, woven through with shimmering threads of gold and silver. As they walk, deep slits in their garments reveal strong copper-colored thighs and slender ankles, while belts of pure gold set off curves above and below their slender waists. Their long black hair stirs gracefully in the gentle morning breeze. It is June, the Southern Hemisphere's winter solstice, the day of the ceremony of Inti Raymi, god of the sun, and one of these 10 women is to be his bride. Last in the queue, Miski pauses to run her hand along the cool stone wall, tracing the perfect mortarless seam with her fingertip. With a deep breath, she summons her courage and follows the others up the long series of steps that lead to the highest point in the city of Machu Picchu, the Sewa Stone, its flat base large enough to hold a llama. Miski pauses for a moment next to the sacred block of granite, and her apprehension returns. Looming over her, a rectangular stone pillar grows up from the Sewa Stone's center, and atop the pillar sits a transparent column of crystal quartz in the shape of an immense phallus. The high priest waits next to the pillar. With a stern look, he wordlessly directs the young women to sit in a semicircle while he methodically stacks the Palo Santo tree's sacred wood near the base of the Sewa Stone. The maidens watch in silence as he lights the fire and gently breathes life into its flames. As the smoky scent of citrus, pine, and mint envelops Miski, she contemplates her fate. The priest then places his forehead against the Sewa Stone, invoking Inti to endow him with clear vision into the spirit world. He turns and approaches the women, pausing to chant a blessing over each of their lowered heads. And then he motions for them to lie down in the shadow cast by the stone pillar. A divine quiet falls upon them, save for the cooing of a pair of doves. Slowly, very slowly, as the sun rises in the sky, the shadow cast by the granite pillar grows ever smaller and then vanishes. In that moment, the sun's rays strike the quartz phallus, and Inti sends a searing radiance onto the forehead of his chosen woman. Miski feels Inti's warmth enter her, and as she closes her eyes against his brilliant glare, she is calm. Behind her closed eyelids, vibrant colors meld from one to the other. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and finally violet white. And in her heart, Miski knows that while she has never lain with a man, she will soon bear a child. Though she would have preferred a daughter, she knows the baby will be a boy, for all of the children conceived in this way are males and will one day become a Wilak Umu, a son of the sun. The Serpent. Chapter 1, March equinox 1512. Machakui lay well hidden at the base of the terrace wall, her scales dark triangles of olive and gray that so closely resembled the stone, even the iguanas weren't aware that she was there. Nearly 7 feet long, the serpent's body was thick and heavy, her broad, flat head the size of a woman's hand. She lay in wait, watching as a little girl, accompanied by a woman heavy with child, unknowingly made their way toward her. When the 2 humans stopped to let the woman catch her breath, Machakui cautiously raised her head to taste their scent with her tongue, then lowered herself again when they continued on, their every step bringing them closer to her hiding place. The child was lovely, a lithe spirit of only 5 winters, too busy looking to the sky for birds and butterflies to watch where she stepped. Machakui scrutinized the bare copper legs flashing in the sun, but it was the thighs of the pregnant woman, revealed by a deep slit in her long tunic, that commanded the serpent's attention. From the uppermost terrace, Miski looked down on the plaza below, where people were just beginning to gather for the celebration of the equinox. Some of them, including her husband, Inca Wena Capek, were already drunk on chicha and would remain so for the next 10 days. She found a place to sit where she could lean against the wall and carefully lowered herself to the ground. She turned her attention to her niece, who was skipping among the large granite boulders, singing softly to herself and stopping here and there to pick wildflowers. Sighing contentedly, Miski hiked up to her tunic to expose her legs to the sun's warmth and dreamily closed her eyes. Slowly, carefully, Machakui began to make her way, undulating through the grass along the stone wall. Now within easy reach of her prey, she slithered into a series of S-shaped coils, paused momentarily, and then struck with quick and deadly force, sinking her fangs deep into the dozing woman's sun-warmed thigh. The woman's scream brought the child running, and Machakui began to retreat. But just as the little girl fell to her knees next to the stricken woman, the serpent suddenly reversed herself, poised to strike again, and then stopped. Events had already been set into motion, and attacking the child would have no effect on the prophecy. Satisfied with her work, Machakui turned and disappeared into the long grass. Miski stared in horror at the venom seeping from the twin holes in her thigh. Her entire leg began to throb and burn, and she felt the venom's fire begin to seep through her veins. Tamia, frozen with fear, stared at the wound, her eyes wide, her hand over her mouth as if to stifle her own scream. Go quickly, Tamia, find the curandera and the Inca. They will know what to do, now. But watch for the serpent, she may not have gone far. A cloud passed overhead, blocking the sun, as a deep fear planted itself in Miski's heart. She did not want her sister's child to see her die. And stay there, Tamia, do you hear me? Do not come back. Miski eased herself into a more comfortable position, intuitively knowing she needed to remain calm. She watched to make sure Tamia had understood her task, then closed her eyes and began counting long, deep breaths. Breathing in, 1, breathing out, 2. In, 1, out, 2. Her fear was as intense as her pain, and even the simple task of counting became nearly impossible. With one hand, she gripped the large emerald pendant that hung from her neck, as her other hand stroked her belly to comfort her unborn child. 1, 2, 1, 2. The poison was swift. As a swollen bruise formed around the bite, Miski felt her heart quicken, each beat reverberating as a painful throb in her thigh that made her nauseous and too dizzy to even sit up. She raised her head just high enough to see a group of people running toward her. The Inca and several other men were in the lead, and behind them she could see the long flowing hair of Suyana the curandera. Be calm, she told herself. 1, 2, 1, 2. The child in her womb was frighteningly still. Suddenly there were people around her, all talking at once, all asking her too many questions. What kind of serpent was it? Did it bite you more than once? Unable to respond, she closed her eyes. Should we carry her to the Inca's palace, or will you treat her here? One asked the curandera. What about the child? Asked another. Miski forced her eyes open and raised her head in an attempt to speak, and then she turned to the side and vomited. She could not help but notice the concern in Suyana's eyes as the curandera wiped the spittle from her lips. When the cloth came away, it was dark with blood. It would only make matters worse to move her, the curandera said. And even though she whispered, Miski heard the words, I cannot save her. I doubt that I can save the child, but I will try. You can deliver the Wilak Umu? Miski heard her husband ask. Yes, but we will have to take him. Take him? I'll have to cut her open in order to remove him from her womb. There was a pause, and then the Inca said in a quiet voice, do it. Miski felt her head being raised and a cup held to her mouth. The liquid was thick and difficult to swallow, and almost immediately it laid a gauzy curtain over her mind. She remained aware of her surroundings, of her clothing being cut away, of the curandera's touch, of the cold silver of a blade, of a scream she knew to be her own. She felt hands reaching into her insides and a weight being lifted from her, and she heard a faraway woman's voice say, Sapa Inca, something is wrong. The baby is a girl. Her husband's response would be the last words Miski would ever hear. Impossible. This cannot be. Get rid of both of them. All right. That's it. Any questions?
I'm gonna stop sharing your screen.
When you going back?
Well, I'd love to go back. Washi and I still stay in touch, and I miss him.
Great, it's a great book.
Thank you, Susie Bell.
Maybe time for one more question.
Nope.
I had a question, but I can't remember what it was. It was way back in the beginning. But I did want to comment that I love your writing is very lush, and I really enjoy that. Like the choice of words that you used to describe things. I really loved that, and I think it's important. But I just thought it was lovely.
Thank you.
I have a question. So the image feeling that you had about writing the book after you did ayahuasca, did the end product match that?
One of my characters takes ayahuasca in the book, and it's a very healing moment for him. So it was so healing for me that I just thought it was part of the whole journey. I mean, people overuse that word, but it was literally and figuratively quite a journey for me. And I just wanted to honor ayahuasca by including her in my book. I was told that ayahuasca stays with you forever. And I think it has. I haven't been tempted to go back. Some of the people who were there with me, we didn't travel together, but they underwent the same ceremonies with me. Some of them have gone back because they felt like it didn't stick. But I'm not ready to go back, so I think I've still got some influence there.
Thank you so much. All right, next we are ending the evening with Matt Daly and poetry. And he says he has maybe one image for us to share, but a little bit about Matt. Matt Daly is the author of the book-length collection Between Here and Home and the chapbook Red State. He is a recipient of, I don't know how to say it, Nellie Blank. Do you know how to say that name?
Yeah, Nelty.
Nelty Blanken, is that how you say it too? Blanchin Award for Writing inspired by the natural world and a creative writing fellowship in poetry from the Wyoming Arts Council. His poems have appeared in various publications. Matt teaches reflective and creative writing in a variety of settings and with a range of audiences. He is the co-founder of Write to Thrive, a business that brings writing practices to individuals and professional groups to cultivate creativity and well-being. Without further ado, Matt Daly and poetry.
Hi, thanks everybody. Thanks for staying tonight. So I had a whole plan, that was all about how my writing life was unplanned. So I'm going to wing it and just read some poems and talk a little bit about craft and process and things, but mostly just read some poems. I did want to say before I read though, Kevin, I'm so glad you're here. And I'd like you to meet Jade. You're both rectangles right now. One of you is a K and one of you is a name on a black screen, but it's nice to see everyone and nice to see people I know. Hey, Maggie. So yeah, I'm just going to read a couple of poems. Just trying to be aware of people's time. I really appreciate you all being here tonight. Yeah, and I just wanted to think a little bit about my own writing process, maybe a little bit more about process. That I feel like it's it's responsive. My poetry is responsive, I guess. And so responding to the world, the land, stuff in the world, the news, people, and other texts too. And so I wanted to read some very recent poems. I'm going to read like a really, I did not intend to do this, but now I'm going to read poems that like have been written in the last month. So I'm going to start with this poem that's the response to this beautiful Neruda poem, Walking Around, which is a really devastating poem that, I don't know, my life is not full of devastating experience, so it feels a little strange to respond to it. But I was at a workshop with this friend, Lori Howe, who teaches in Laramie. And we read this poem and asked her to respond to it. But I'd driven to Casper, and so there was sort of stuff about the drive and musing there. So Neruda's poem, Walking Around, starts with the line, "It so happens I am sick of being a man." And so this is this poem after Neruda's Walking Around. "It so happens I'm sick of being in love again after ridgetop cornices love-leaden fell. Buttercups popped again through thaw mold. Why, just yesterday, I set 3 pairs of shoes in the back of my car and chipped my way through a whiteout pass, a gray and gold prairie, all those deer steaming and not yet gut piles on the roadside. All this chill world to fall for and me, just in it. I stopped to pee where the whole Wind River turns into a project, a cow project, a beet project, an alfalfa project, and the reservation riverbed crisps like a cutthroat trout on sand. I took a pick that was mostly dashboard and tarmac and took off. But before the ancient ocean bed again swallowed my little onyx Subaru, which I tried to name the Grackle, but still just call the truck after the red truck of my solitude, before the gobbling up that this rectangle state I loved, I sent the image of me leaving to the one I never want to leave. And like the river, there was no current to her, just a red exclamation point walled by a red ring. My shoes shuffled over frost-heaved bumps. My breath flapped furiously against the wind before turning fleet as needles into shoulders, her knife hand over unwashed vegetables. While feathers of clouds streaked before the gray bank snowstorm, before the eroding cliffs, before the dark before dark, and just like that, I'm sick of being in love with being in love. Like some warlord longing for years for tree bed and axe ring and home shore, and then taking a nap while the winds cackled him away to one of the old habits where he could have started or stayed. I'm a pile of feathers, or maybe a wind, or potentially a whole flock of high-step songbirds dodging tractor-trailer shrieks on the chalkboard smear where I might have fled in a calculation I call a proof. What I am sick of is not the wind chill, ice, holding the door shut like a night sleeper, but the notion of numbers being what they are, like 1 + 1 = 2 instead of 1 + 1 = 2. When I become again a man standing by a woman in a kitchen with a counter made of trees, a knife block, a stack of yams, I will divide the vegetables into pieces of vegetables, which also sums as bodies to rocker storm gusts together, or just the evening quieting down. So what to say about that? You know, there's this way that I think drives are great for poets, long drives. I finally the voice memo, I used to like pull over and write things down, you know, but I think more and more I think about writing as just the record of human experience. I think this year in particular has made me feel that poems as a way to reveal experience, as a way to reveal each other and ourselves to each other, feels very powerful to me, even in this world that we're still in for a bit. So that's, I guess, I write in two ways. Thinking about sort of as everyone's tonight been talking about their process, I write in two ways. I write that way, just responding openly to the moment, I guess, and all of the threads that weave together in that moment. But then also I love to have projects as a poet. So I'm working on a project right now that I thought I'd read one poem from each of the sections that I think will happen in the project. So I have this horrible ancestor, Cotton Mather, the Mathers, Increased Mather, Cotton Mather. These are like, Cotton Mather was influential in sort of fomenting the energy around the Salem witch trials as a minister. And once I found out about him, I was kind of alarmed that this is my ancestor, but also amazed that he was a prolific and influential person. And like, how do you deal with this? So I've done nothing with it for 30 years, and now I'm trying to do something with it. And so doing, again, it was about response for me. So I chose to read a bunch of Mather. And then I thought, well, I'll just read him and I'll respond to what I read in poems. And I went searching to find what to read. And I found this book called The Wonders of the Invisible World, which is like an extraordinarily beautiful title, I think. The Wonders of the Invisible World. And the whole book is really all about like how to tell who the witches are in your neighborhood and then oppress them, right? Like it's a horrible, but it has this beautiful title. So I set out to write this book of a collection of poems, see where it went, just read, respond. And strangely, I thought it was going to be about gender. I thought it was going to be about power. I thought it was going to be, I can't remember who it was that I heard say that what we need is the investigation of whiteness, the way we investigate other races, cultures, ethnicities. And I thought, well, what's my part in that as a cisgender white man, almost 50? Maybe I'm the person who needs to investigate my own whiteness. And then the poems all became about the land. Strangely, they have nothing to do with any of the things I thought they were going to be about, but all about land and my personal relationship to it, which was a surprise. So I'm just going to read 3 in succession, and then I'll be done. And then it'll be 8 o'clock, and hopefully we'll be right on time. So here are 3 poems. The sections of the book are the wonder is animal, the wonder is plant, and the wonder is land. My sister was here earlier, so I'll read this one from The Wonder is Animal. The wonder is animal, honeybee. My sister's hand in the clover lawn, pollen-skinned from the clumsy stumbles of laden honeybees. To say we knew the truth of species full of their intersections, coat and pierce, or something else as evidence of even fear or as one among our bloomings, would be a lie. She simply held a body in her palm while I combed my still soft fingers under the green stems, sending legs at their sweet work, tumbling down knucklebound. So that's a little something about animals. I'm going to read these 2. Yeah. The wonder is plant. These are both kind of connected. The wonder is plant, thimbleberry. We often gorged among the hackled branches near tumult streams. Our world was plain as granite scree. What was familiar was sad people and the slow erosion of sad people. I would come to no sandstone, no tamarisk, throat-handling desert streams, and a woman invaded by weeds, and he would come to know how to carry a car-wrecked girl away from Montana before the cops came. But in our teens, we just knew altitude was red and seedy and tasted like shards where marmots perched in our final Augusts. Years later, we tried to fall in love or to act at last on the years of falling. But for a couple of lean-bodied summers, we did not need the simple sadness of our bodies squeezed into the same clutch. We knew which red fruit we would pull from brambles and swallow, and which harvest would prick us. Oh, it's worth saying these are all based on these bits of Mather. So I'll read for the last poem I want to read tonight, which is Boulderfield. I'll read a little bit of the Mather. So this is from this piece within the Wonders of the Invisible World, the trial of GB at the Court of Oyer and Terminer, held in Salem, 1692. This passage is an explanation of a sort of exposition of a trial of a witch or a warlock. And this little passage that spoke to me, and so I would just read them, and then a passage would kind of draw its attention to, or my attention to it, and then I just would respond. So what I'll do is read the quote from Mather, and then I'll read the poem. Glad should I have been if I had never known the name of this man, or never had this occasion to mention so much as the first letters of his name. But the government requiring some account of his trial to be inserted in this book, it becomes me with all obedience to submit unto the order. So this is the response. The wonder is land, Boulderfield. He splayed his hands across space in a split granite chunk, both the size and shape of a hay loaf we'd never pitched flakes from down to the cattle herding below. No ranch work had shaped our shoulders. His gecko-wide finger pads gripped the stippled stone. I followed his ease with my clumsiness and fear until we both squatted ape-like on the boulder top and watched the scree field mirror the storm clouds gathering Augustward, and my departure from this brotherhood that had not yet turned to anything desperate or other than between boys. I trembled. Afternoon warmed the way down the slow igneous cascade toward glacier melt, to named streams, to levee-bound river coursing near our homes. My time was coming to hem in. He scrambled his scramble down while I scooted ignobly on my belly flesh, scoured by pricks of rock until I rashed and bled. He was never one to laugh at my faults. He waited while I shamed myself, uninjured and muttering, to meet him. The valley formed into cloudless haze, paused before predictable flashes and resonance from what humidity built up between the ridgelines. Already I was vapor-like, and already frozen, and far off, and lifting from the crashing surf, and a solitude that for years would cling to me. So that's a few little poems. It's 2 minutes to 8. So again, thinking about this, this process of like responding, and what's been, I guess, really interesting to me and was true of my book too, that I love the idea with poems of trusting that the response is not going to be literal, but it is actually a response to whatever it is, whatever the kind of triggering impulse is for the poem, or the triggering town is what Richard Hugo calls it, but that the material of the poem sort of coalesces around that the sort of gravitational pull of whatever got it started, even if that material doesn't quite make sense in direct relation to that, whatever the origin. So I don't know. Do people have questions, or what should we do? Yeah, Joanna.
Well, I have two questions, and I'm just going to know that you can figure out which one pulls you to a response, which one has a stronger gravitational pull. And one of them has to do with your title, your kind of like synopsis, which you spontaneously deviated from, which was so fresh and fun. But you talked about how working with kids and teaching kids to write poetry has taught you about writing poetry. So I wonder more about that. And then the second question, again, multiple choice or user's choice, is like, so one of the things in writing novels is, well, I found anyways, that I do editing, which I'm kind of like fussing with the icing on the cake, or I'm revising and I'm making a totally different recipe. And I wonder what that looks like from the poetic experience of writing. Do you do the same, like you write your poem and then you realize that like the pieces are all in the wrong place and you're recrafting the entire recipe, and you're thinking about the cadence of a specific word in a specific line? So whichever one you want to answer.
I'll try to answer both quickly. The first question, I think, because I didn't study poetry, I started teaching it. I just agreed to start teaching through partners here and then other arts organizations in Wyoming. And I started having to write poems as examples as I was teaching students how to write poems. So I figured I should start writing them. And then they asked me about publishing. So I started feeling like, oh no, I better start trying to publish poems. So it really was this like trial and error process of working with young people and really wanting them to feel as much value in the engagement with creative writing of any kind as I felt. But I just felt like I kind of owed it to them to get my act together. So I tried to figure out how to do that. Still, I'm trying to figure that out. I was with a group of little kids today. It's like age 6 through 10 writing poems, and just some of what they write, it's like, oh man, I got a long way to go. These guys they really are on it. You know, it's beautiful. Revising, yeah, I feel like I do a little bit of both. I try to do that wholesale revision first, like these poems started. I was really interested also in thinking about how to write against someone like Mather's writing. Like there are these great texts of his that sound exactly like the logic of Donald Trump. It's like eerie how exactly the same it is. I was like, well, how do I compose this so it doesn't take on the logic of the language? So I was playing with this space in the middle of the line, the caesura, right, which is the space in the middle of a line of poetry. Because English Old English has that space. Old English poetry has this space in the middle of it. It has a different organizing principle than contemporary English. So I thought, well, maybe that precedes this kind of like language of witch burning, like the logic of the witch burners that's exhibited in the grammar and syntax of the language. And then I just really, that worked some and it didn't work in others. So then I started playing with just like right justifying all the poems, and suddenly like how the line breaks play out if everything's on the right. So anyway, I like that kind of wholesale stuff. I guess separate from the word by word, although then they start to affect each other. So it becomes a seething mess, is what it becomes. Yeah, but I love the revision process. It's my favorite part. Working on my book, that was my favorite part of it, was revising, because the book is a series of persona poems. It's like 45 poems or 47 or something. So to change a line in one poem, because there's a narrative echoing across all these voices, would mean like having to cascade the revision through like 30 or 40 different poems. So I had to lay them all out, and it just became this like very sensory experience to revise the poems, not just like an intellectual experience. It's cool.
Kevin has a question in the chat. Kevin, did you want to ask your question, or do you want someone else to read it?
No, I'll ask it. So hi, Matt.
Hi.
So I sort of felt like in the poems that you chose to read, there was a theme of aloneness or isolation, or you could even sort of say stillness in some ways. But then there's the juxtaposition to in that place, you have so much more awareness of observation in terms of what you're seeing around you. And I didn't know if these poems are recent enough that this is pandemic related to you, or if this is just part and parcel of Matt Daly.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that it's funny that you bring that up, Kevin, because I think it's very much pandemic related, uh, and I should think about this with other poets. My friends who I read poems with, like if there's a stronger theme of isolation and aloneness, I think it also has to do with responding to this text, there's something about the voice in Mather, although he's always trying to connect to community, but something about his voice feels very, in trying to establish itself as this authority, feels very alone. It feels really sad, actually, like it's always sort of attacking and blaming and scolding and judging other people in this way that it feels quite alone. And so, I guess maybe that there's a responding solitude that's actually not about that, but about healing. Actually, the poems to me feel like there's something in them that's about when I've felt most at home, which I guess is outside by myself and with good friends.
Have you read M. Norbase Phillips? She had she wrote Zong, which is she takes a document where in the 1800s a British slave ship was going to port, but the owners of the slave ship drowned all of the slaves because they could make more money on the insurance payout than if they had actually brought the slaves to shore. And so she takes this legal document of a court case where the insurance payers didn't want to pay the insurance on this thing. And so she takes this and then uses that, does erasure poetry to it and mines it to release the voices of all the drowned slaves. So maybe like erasure poetry could be another technique to respond to the text of your ancestor that is icky and release voices that are from there too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it makes me think there's did you just see there's Nicole Seeley erasure poem that's from the trial, Derek Chauvin's trial transcript. It's a really it's very short, but it's, it takes up pages of the transcript and then the poem is quite short within it. It's really powerful. Yeah. I tried that, but didn't have any luck.
Yeah.
So.
Any other questions? Demi, I see you put your screen on. Do you have a question for Matt? No? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This is really lovely. And thanks to all our writers. And if you want to share with your friends, we have the recording and I can share the recording too. But we plan to do, this is an annual thing. And yes, hopefully we can meet in person again and be a balm to that loneliness, right? So it's not just the act of writing and it's the sharing of writing and the listening and reading that heals us all and helps us connect. Thank you so much and we'll see you next time.
Thank
I'd
you
like
so
to
much, Leah.
quickly just say thank you to all of you. I got on just to see Gail because she's been my friend since the 4th grade, but I totally enjoyed everybody's. And wow, what an eye opener on writing and how you come about it, and just very, very interesting. And I especially like the second gal that did the teenage stuff, because I've got a 12 and a 15-year-old granddaughters. So that was interesting. Anyway, thank you all so very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Thanks.